Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask an interesting question that's probably going to be a little bit complicated to try to answer because really this kind of raises multiple other questions and different things that people bring up in the community kind of all in one go. So I'm going to try to give this a comprehensive answer. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on some crafting, and let's dig into this. All right, the individual asked basically, look, I know what your numbers are that you recommend for people to gain muscle as far as protein intake. And actually it's 1 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So basically it means if you weigh 220 pounds, that's 100 kilos, you need 100 to 160 grams of protein. That's your baseline number to gain muscle. And guys, that assumes you're actually trying to gain muscle. If you're not trying to at least gain the body weight of the muscle mass that you're gaining, you're not actively trying to gain muscle that hard. Meaning if you're trying to maintain your weight or lose weight, those numbers become skewed. That number is no longer adequate for that goal. This is for people who are actively trying to at least lean bulk or clean bulk a little bit, trying to put on some actual muscle tissue weight. So the question he asked though on that was, okay, so that is that number still applicable if I eat almost all of my protein at one point in the day? And do I need to eat more protein later in the day if I hit that number really early in the day and don't eat any more protein later in the day? Is it going to hinder me? And this is a sort of convoluted question that people get into, and it particularly becomes complicated when people start doing things like intermittent fasting and everything that's getting a lot more popular. All right, cliff notes. When we're giving recommendations like that, that assumes you're actually trying to gain muscle. There's no way you would be intermittent fasting if your goal was to actually put on any serious amount of muscle mass. Intermittent fasting is at best a recomposition tool and generally is going to be a weight loss tool. It's not particularly useful for people who are trying to gain muscle mass at a significant rate. So it shouldn't even be considered there. But the answer is, yeah, you're going to need to get more protein in because the protein that you ate isn't really being utilized as protein. Because you're overeating all of it at one time, you're probably converting a lot of it to glycogen and using it as carbs. You're going to need more later in the day if you do it that way. Now, let's go into the nuances a little bit. And I do want to state with that remember, guys, this is not stuff that you need to obsess over. If you're not a competitive athlete, you're not being competitive in some weight class sport or trying to gain maximum muscle mass because it actually earns you income in some way or something you compete in, at least for a trophy or an award, it's probably not worth worrying about this stuff to this level of minutia. People who don't compete in anything, who are just trying to gain some muscle, obsess over things that really only matter a little bit. And that's what you need to remember. So many guys spend so much time doing what a lot of us call majoring in the minors. They spend 90% of their time worrying about stuff that only accounts for 10% of their gains. And they don't spend enough time worrying about the basic stuff that really gives them the most gains. Hey, how can I add 5 pounds to my deadlift? How can I, improve my 5 rep max or 8 rep max on my squat? Am I doing enough sets of barbell rows? The stuff they really need to be asking to put on serious amounts of muscle mass, a lot of guys kind of forget about. And they focus on those little bitty nuances. Am I getting enough protein? How much do I need to spread out the timing on that? Guys, this is the stuff that accounts for 10% of your total progress. The other stuff, how much weight am I moving? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I increasing my workload quickly enough in the gym on the big, heavy barbell exercises? That's the stuff you need to be worrying about. That's 90% of your results right there. So majoring in the minors, though, sometimes is important, though, to actually look at the stuff. Just not obsess over it. This is the stuff you worry about when you have everything else perfect. You're on a fantastic training program with good programming and great progression, and you've got your sleep pattern sorted out, your rest and recovery. That's when we start worrying about stuff like meal timing. After you have the really important stuff sorted, then we worry about this little bitty stuff that might give you 0.5% better progress. Now, do you need more protein than the minimums that we suggested if you're really messing with your meal timing inappropriately? Yes, meaning if you have 12 or 16 hour windows here or there where you're eating almost no calories and you're trying to gain muscle mass, yeah, you're going to need more protein than I recommend. It's not going to work. In fact, the fact that if you're doing any sort of fasting protocol, or again, like he's saying, he's eating all of his protein in the morning, like within a 4 or 5 hour window, well, know that you didn't get all your protein because it needs to be somewhat evenly spaced. There's only so much muscle that you're going to gain as far as like anabolic drive and everything from consuming too much protein at one time. And I'm not saying it's not going to help further down, but it is going to be a blunted response, meaning you're going to see a diminished return on it. And it gets confusing then when people start talking about fast absorbing protein, slow absorbing proteins. But you need to remember everything absorbs slower once you're no longer fasted. After you've had your first meal of the day, everything else slows down. Nothing absorbs that fast. Things like even glycemic response and protein absorption, everything slows down once you have real food and fiber and everything in your gut. But there is a diminished return, and I know that you're still obviously digesting and absorbing protein from a meal you ate 8 hours ago, but what you have happen, no matter what happens at that meal, even though there's that slow curve like that after you eat, and it might even take you a full day to get all that protein out of that meal, you are getting most of it in the first few hours. You know, probably the first 3 or 4 hours, you have probably absorbed 80% or more of that protein from that meal. So you've gotten the big burst of like the anabolic signal from all the leucine and everything in there. You've gotten most of that in the first few hours. So realistically speaking, if you're not consuming a reasonable amount of protein, you know, reasonable varies. Reasonable could be, 20 or 25 grams, depending on your body weight. At least once every 5 or 6 hours, you probably, or maybe 8 hours at the most, you're probably not really maximizing your like anabolic signal as far as the amino acids you're taking in. And definitely if you're going more than about 8 hours. And I think even Alan Aragon has discussed this in the past a lot, of we don't actually know what the ideal protein timing is because we don't have enough data to determine what's going to give you an ideal anabolic drive and everything that's going to boost muscle protein synthesis. But he speculates, and again, he's got a pretty good background in this stuff. Alan is very well educated in nutritional science, both formally and as far as research studies go, and by coaching a lot of people himself personally, including some top-level athletes, like some NFL players even. So he's got a pretty good understanding of this, and he says it's probably in the range of 3 or 4 meals a day. You probably need about 3 to 4 servings of protein. We don't know the ideal number, but he's like, I'd be willing to bet his professional gamble, he said before, is probably going to be something like 3, maybe 4 servings of protein a day. And that's assuming you're fairly evenly dividing those. So if you're consuming the amount that I tell you to consume, let's say you end up with roughly 120 grams of protein a day, based upon the calculations I gave you, if you're eating 100 of that in the first 4 hours of the day, that 20 to last you the other 20 hours of the day is probably not going to give you like an ideal amount of protein turnover in the body and absorption and anabolic drive and everything else. It's not going to be ideal. So if you're going to consume that much in one sitting, you're probably going to need more protein than I recommend overall, not because you need more total, but because later in the day you're really kind of blunting your total muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. If you're only eating 20 grams spread out over, the next 20 hours, it's just not ideal. You probably are going to need to consume another couple of decent sized meals in there. So if you're doing 100, even though, the range I gave you might put you at something like 80 to 140 grams based on your body weight, well, yeah, if you're consuming 100 of that 80 to 140 grams all in one time in one big meal in the day, you're probably going to need at least 40 grams a couple more times a day, maybe 8 hours apart roughly, just to keep everything flowing as far as muscle protein synthesis. So you're probably going to need more protein than I recommend as your minimum to really gain significant and large amounts of muscle mass. You might end up eating 180 then, which is outside of my range. Not because you actually need that total intake, but because you consuming such a large amount in a small window that it's not maximizing on it the rest of the day. Now, ultimately, is that particularly important? No, it might only give you a little tiny bit more muscle every year to do what I'm saying there. It's a pretty small difference, most likely. So it might not even be worth obsessing over, meaning if you have one day to where suddenly you had an 8 hour window and the only food you can find is a bunch of carbs with almost no protein that only has 5 or 6 grams of protein in it, and then you're not going to be able to eat again for another 6 or 8 hours because of some scheduling at work or food availability. Is that really going to make that big of a deal? Probably not, particularly if it's only for a day or two. It's not that big of a deal. It isn't going to affect you noticeably. So it's not something you need to have anxiety over and stress over, because you know what? Having anxiety and stress over your diet and training will elevate stress hormones and cortisol potentially enough that that might actually hurt your gains more than the little bit of protein you missed. You know, stress and anxiety hurt muscle gains and recovery a lot more than minor hiccups in your diet. So, you know, stressing over that isn't going to be worth it either. So look at it in that perspective. You can't stress it or worry about that. It's not like you're going to lose a whole ounce of muscle or something because you missed a meal for the day and you only got one big serving or two big servings of protein that day. It's probably not going to matter. It's just you might gain slightly less muscle that day than you could have. And you know what? Your individual days don't matter that much as long as they're one-offs like that. They're not going to have any significant effect. So it's not worth stressing over, but that stress could mess with you. So ultimately, it's not worth stressing over these little things. But it is important to note, though, going back to the point about needing to spread them out to some extent is one reason that things like intermittent fasting just really isn't ideal for people who are trying to gain muscle, because ultimately you're not giving yourself enough muscle protein synthesis. You're not really spreading your food out the way that you need to ideally. You're kind of lumping all your food into one little small window in the day, and that's not ideal for building muscle mass, recovery, sometimes even training performance. It's not ideal, which is why people need to understand that things like intermittent fasting, of course, have their place as dietary tools, particularly fat loss tools for some people, but they are going to hinder your ability to maximize on muscle gain. Now, how much are they going to hinder it? We don't know. We know that they'll probably hinder it. Is it going to cost you 10% of your gains, or is it going to cost you 30 or 40% of your gains? I don't know. We don't have enough data on that. But based upon what we do know about needing to at least get a few meals of protein in every day, spread out somewhat evenly, they don't have to be perfectly even, just reasonably even. Based on that, we know that that does seem to be somewhat important, at least mildly important, for gaining muscle mass. Then yeah, I mean, if you're doing a big fasting protocol or something, or you're trying to consume all your protein in a 4 or 5 hour window every day, you're not really going to maximize the amount of muscle you could gain. Are you still going to be able to make decent gains, maybe even good gains? Yeah, most likely, probably, as long as everything else is on point. You're at least getting sufficient protein. You're training properly. You're recovering. You're sleeping. You're getting enough calories in. Yeah, you'll probably be okay. You'll make decent gains. You're just not going to make anywhere near the amount of gains you could make. So that's ultimately all you're arguing about here. You're just doing one thing, hoping for a certain benefit, and maybe sacrificing a little bit of something else. And just like many other things in life, there's just all give and take there. But at the end of the day, is this sort of thing worth really obsessing over or stressing over if it doesn't affect your career or something like that, something really important in some way? Probably not. Remember that stress can actually hurt your gains even more than missing a little bit of protein here and there. All right, guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.